Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We're talking about test smarter, not harder, scaling test automation with API and visual testing. My name is Susie. I'm a member of the marketing team here at Sauce Labs. Joining me today are three of my Sauce Labs colleagues. We have our Chief Customer Officer, Matt Wyman, Senior Solutions Engineer, Sangeet Patel, and our Director of Product, Kunal Jain. It's now my pleasure to pass the mic over to Matt Wyman to kick off today's conversation.
All right, thank you, Susie. So I think this is going to be a fun webinar. We've got a couple interesting areas to dig into with some depth. Before we get started, I want to spend just a quick moment and talk about a few of the trends that we're seeing. And certainly we're in a fun situation in that we are both consumers of our product as well as people that get to help listen to all of your experiences and see what's going on in the market. So these are some of the trends that we're seeing, and then we're also feeling ourselves. But to set the stage, I think it's often fun, if not useful, to kind of think about the past and think about history and come how did we get to where we are today? And just for fun, we set it up as three eras. And one can quibble a bit about, oh, exactly when did they start and stop? But I think that broadly speaking, these are three important differentiated times in how we approach software development and how we approached quality. If you think back, and many of us were not working this time period, but if you think back to the 80s and 90s, this was the silo era. This was the time when it was hard to write code. Like it was just difficult to build anything, much less distribute it. And the world was all about building bespoke software. Distribution was all physical, whether it was by floppy disk or by CD-ROM or whatnot. It was very much a world where we were just starting to get into the network and then eventually, obviously, cloud and whatnot. And that, as we get to the end of that period, we start seeing applications that are now a little more available, a little more open. And then we enter into the SaaS era and things exploded, right? The cloud really exploded. And this is where we see Selenium come up. This is where we start to see agility take the forefront. We start to see teams working together. We start to see more and more people getting involved in software development, but still the roles are very well defined. You still have very distinctly defined engineers and operations and QA, and everything's very organized, if you will, from a structure standpoint. And we see that the pace has improved from quarterly releases to often weekly releases, but still it's a bit rigid. People are moving as quickly as they can. And then you think about the 10 years that we've just been through, and with the rise of DevOps, you see more teaming, you see a lot of blurriness in some of the roles, you start to see people crossing over, you see the rise of teams that are there to support other teams. Of course, you start to see microservices and smaller units of change. And suddenly we're moving from weekly into daily and sometimes faster than daily. Everything's getting automated. We're really moving forward. It's a lot easier to build software in this world, or to be more specific, the software we're building is a lot more complex. We're solving more complex problems. So software is never easy, but the kinds of problems we're tackling were unthinkable in the silo era, right? Everything is connected now. In this DevOps period, everything got faster. And I think this is the tension all of us are experiencing. Now, Amazon is obviously a massive company. And so the fact that they have a release every 11 seconds is at least partially due to the fact that they have so many people writing software. But it's also because they're so focused on automation, and they're so focused on how to be efficient and how to move quickly. They see it as a competitive advantage, and all of us are feeling it, right? This is true everywhere now. The software we're writing and the software we're testing is a business advantage to our organizations. We know we have to move quickly. I think it's interesting to see how rapidly people are getting to PRs, how quickly teams are supporting one another. The 5 hours to me represents teams supporting one another. It shows how interconnected we are and how aware we are of those interconnections and how important they are. And then of course, this third trend, which has just been explosive over the last 5 years, is around the number of devices that are out in the world. And when I'm talking about active mobile devices here, this is actually specific to phones and tablets. We're not even including things like watches or set-top boxes or other types of environments where we're writing code and delivering code and having to test. And it's also interesting that we expect in 2022, it's going to increase by a full billion. So 21, there were 14 billion devices available. In 22, they're projecting 15.9. So it's a massive increase on that side. And more of what we're doing every day has to now work in a mobile environment. It's not acceptable to only work with the blinders in one place, in just web or just mobile. You have to think holistically across all of them. I'm going to argue that this is the world of experience, that we've moved past the moment where we're just trying to build software. We're now, as both professionals in technology, but also as business, because now we are all business people at the same time, we're worried about the customer experience. We're worried about how people experience our products. That's our advantage. It's not just going fast. It's going fast and providing an amazing experience to our customers, which means quality has gone through this amazing arc over the past 30 years, where at one point it was an afterthought. Then it became something very central as we understood it needed to be in automation. And we saw Selenium and we saw functional testing and functional automation come to the fore. Then we moved into a period of DevOps where it became a question of how fast can we go through it? How quickly can we get through our validation and get to a deploy? But now we're thinking about quality differently. I'd suggest today what we're hearing from customers, when we talk to people, what we're hearing is quality is understood to be a gatekeeper for the user experience, which it always has been in truth, but now people are recognizing how critical and how important and how much leverage there is. And so people are changing their approaches to quality. They're thinking about it a little bit differently. And you can see that in the trends. So we talked about velocity. We also see quality and test shifting, right? All of you are experiencing this. It's not just one team's problem anymore. This is now something we think about across the board, from the moment code is written all the way through to the time it's in production. And production is where we actually see a lot more of our risk gates moving. With feature flags and canaries and all of those capabilities that we use to manage how software is released into production, we're now seeing this environment where people are recognizing that they have to understand what's in production and how things are behaving for an actual customer. That's the production piece. And then feeding that back into the rest of their life cycle. It creates this loop. And we're testing in many different ways across the entire loop. And it's no longer acceptable to just be in one portion of the loop. This is what we're hearing. When we're talking to people who are right there working, such as yourselves, day to day, you're not just worried about, oh, did my code work on my machine? No. You're having to nurture and take care of the entire experience all the way through. And if there's an error in production, you need to be alerted. And the more quickly you can be alerted to that, the more quickly you can respond, the more effective not only is your organization as a development organization, but your business overall. Many more types of tests, many more types of quality, many more gates, and we're moving through all of these significantly faster. And we think that one of the benefits that the organizations that are leaning into that are gaining is actually reducing some of their large suites and redistributing some of that workload into other areas. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about visual testing. We're going to talk about API testing. And we see that the top quartile, if you will, organizations are taking their integration tests, their large functional suites, and they're asking themselves, is this test here because I'm actually validating a full end-to-end integration? Or is this test here actually to validate visual elements? What types of checks am I actually doing on this page? What kind of assertions are we actually doing? And so what we're seeing is this improvement, if you will, for the sake of both velocity and experience, where people are shifting some of their workloads. They're shifting into API because API tests are significantly faster. And if you have API orchestration with, which we do, and Sanjit will show that in just a few moments, if you can orchestrate your APIs, then you can run tests that validate integration pathways, but you can remove the entire front end of the experience, which means you can do it in seconds instead of in minutes. So this is the world we're living in. We see more and more pressure to go further and further down this path. And I'll come back at the very end and talk a bit about how we're doing that strategically. But right now, what I'd like to do is hand it over and start to dig into these two areas, visual and API tests, and start talking about how those two tools in particular can help you move a lot faster in your testing.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Matt. Yeah, so I think one of the key things, and not to really boil down everything that Matt brought up in 5 or 6 slides, is really at the end of the day, moving quicker, testing a lot more, testing earlier. It boils down to your main goal being delivering that, what we call digital confidence, right? Which is having your customers have the best experience exactly like you intended every single time, right? So that idea of ensuring that regardless of what end scenario your user is coming to you from, what device, what OS version, that they're going to have that same great quality that any other customer using your product is going to have. And that's sort of the goal of testing the right way. And so something one of my colleagues, Titus Fortner, who also works at Sauce Labs, came up with is this idea of the change in thought process we have around the testing pyramid. So the traditional classic test pyramid looks like this, where you have unit tests at the bottom, they're done a lot, and then you slowly dwindle down into integration and UI testing, that DOM-to-DOM testing. And so the heavy focus on unit testing just shows that sort of silo thinking, right? If my one piece works well, everything else should work fine, but you're not getting into that. Everything's a holistic view now, and everything needs to be tested that way. And traditionally, the way this is done is developers will do unit testing of their individual pieces. QAs will end up doing this DOM-to-DOM testing, and that integration piece in the middle sort of falls to the side, right? Devs are saying, oh, the QA should do it. QA say the dev should do it. Nobody really does it at the end of the day. And I think that's a huge piece that we're losing on, that is crucial to that delivering that confidence that your product is going to work well at the end of the day. And so something that I think is a rethinking of this would be to cut up the pyramid into 4 pieces, right? Having unit tests and service tests down at the bottom, and then API tests and DOM-to-DOM tests at the top. Now, this is a good start, I think, right? So that idea of having the service layer and the API layer tested in the middle is crucial, and it's very important. But I still think, and so does Titus, thinks that this is still sort of lagging in thinking, right? So as you can see here, still doing a ton of unit testing, a ton of service testing, and dwindling as we get towards the top. And so reimagining this into actually what Titus is calling the test diamond, which is actually decreasing the amount of unit tests you're doing and increasing that testing in the middle, the service layer, the API layer, the stuff that I think is crucial and really just runs much quicker. And so this idea of rethinking the way you're doing testing so that the important stuff in the middle gets tested a lot more and a lot quicker. One thing I did want to point out is in my 2 slides here, you can see there's that dotted line where I kind of divide up dev and QA. Don't get me wrong, I don't think there should be a divide. And I think especially in service layer and API layer, this is where the most forward-thinking testers combine the efforts, right? Having your devs and your QAs work together to test this API and service layer, right? The devs are going to know their individual services and their individual APIs, and the QAs are going to have that idea of a holistic integration, connecting the pieces together and working together to test this is something that I've seen done, and I've seen done really well. And what ends up happening is you don't lose anything in the middle, right? That the handoff is much crisper, the deployments are much quicker because everything gets tested along the way. And so this idea of heavying up in the middle, really enables that collaboration across teams and really make sure that everything gets tested properly along the way. And so all of that to really jump into APIs, right? How should you be testing your APIs? What's the proper way of doing it? And I think there's two sort of best practices. The basics, which I think everyone is sort of doing, which is testing everything, right? Test your endpoints, test everything, including response code, content type, test your objects, what's being returned, sort of the basics of API testing, which are crucial. And if you're not doing that, then you're really not testing your APIs. I think what is really important to do is going a step beyond this. And so this is where a lot of folks stop. This is that manual API testing, right? I made a call to my API. I looked at the response, I saw the headers, and I think we're good to go. But going a step beyond and starting to automate your API tests and really testing things like functionality and business logic, right? So variabilizing your test for reuse, being able to data drive that test so that you can run through 1,000 input parameters to make sure that the outputs are consistent and returning what should be returned. Validating things like business logic, right? If I am searching my API, so like if you're a retailer and your API is powering your retail site, if I'm searching for a desk, then the API should return details like something like the instructions to build a desk should only be returned when you're looking for a desk, right? If I'm trying to buy a TV mount, I shouldn't get desk instructions. It just doesn't make sense. So testing things like that, where your output matches your input is crucial. Using dynamic data, right? Very important. I've seen a lot of tests where it's, yeah, well, I tested if I input one ID that the output is right. Well, that's not always going to be the case, right? Make sure that every input ID is validated on the output side. And then the last two here, I think, are crucial. That integration end-to-end testing, this is something that we do a lot on the UI side of things, right? You test an entire end-to-end flow from logging into your website, adding something to a cart, checking out from your cart, logging out. That's something you do on the UI side, and you say, yeah, I know that APIs are powering this, but I validated in the UI, and if the UI test worked, I think we're good to go. And that's not always the case, right? Because when you're doing a UI level test, you're testing one scenario, and generally you're testing one scenario because one scenario takes 30 minutes to test. And so you can't test 1,000 scenarios. It's going to take forever. Well, if you boil that down and actually test the backend APIs that are powering that entire flow in the exact same way, log into your website, add something to a cart, check out from the cart, log out from your website, all of that powered by APIs tested in that same flow can now be run with thousands of scenarios because an API test takes seconds to run. So running 1,000 tests is probably still going to be quicker than running one scenario on the UI side, right? Not saying don't validate the flow on the UI. That's super important. You want to validate things like page load times and the scroll functionality. But for validating data, especially if your data is just API driven, you should really do it at that layer. And then the last one here, I think sort of seems very basic, but something that I think a lot of folks don't do is just validating that your response matches your request, right? Like I said earlier, if I asked for a desk, I should get desk details. If I asked for a TV mount, I should get TV mount details. The last thing I wanted to talk about before I jump into some demos is sort of also teeing up visual testing, but this idea of smarter testing, right? Testing smarter, especially in this new era of continuous integration, continuous delivery, where everything is constantly being tested on build. How should you be doing that, especially when you're integrating multiple types of testing? And one thing that I found after working with customers that are doing API and UI and visual is what sort of hierarchy do you put on your testing, right? And I think that putting API tests at the top is very important, right? So you run your API tests first in your pipeline. They run much faster than your UI tests. They can help determine errors a lot quicker. And if your backend APIs are failing, there's sort of no point of running a UI test because essentially that's going to fail anyway, right? Not saying that the UI test isn't as important, but don't run a 2-hour UI test if you already know that there's some errors happening in the backend. Go ahead and fix those errors first, then rerun your testing pipeline. And then that way your UI tests only get run one time and you can properly validate that way. And so that I've seen folks implement that and save tons of hours in waiting for test results and then retesting and redeploying. So running those API tests right at the top, I think, is important. And then the next two are sort of up for debate, how you want to run them. I would probably put the visual tests after that in the middle. And this is really just to ensure that your snapshots are there in case your site is crashing or your test is not working properly, to have those snapshots ready and put to the side before you run your UI tests, right? So I would say, even if your visual test fails, I would still run my UI test because you're testing different things. Your UI test is testing functionality, right? So running both of those, regardless of failures, I think is important. But having the visual test run first so that all your snapshots are done and ready. So that way, in case your UI test fails, majorly, and then your pipeline stops or something like that, you don't want to lose out on having snapshots. And I think this is something that Kunal is going to go into a lot more detail later, but the importance of having those snapshots, even when you're testing functionality on UI, is there, right? You're going to get a lot different of a data set from visual snapshots than you are from functional assertions and things like that. So I won't go too deep into that. I'll leave that for Kunal to go over a little bit later. But with all that being said, I did want to jump into some quick high-level demos. And so the first thing I want to talk about is API testing. And so something that is really important in API testing, what we talked about, is testing everything, right? And an easy way to accomplish this is sort of how we've thought about it here at Sauce Labs in Sauce API testing, which is the way we do our auto-generated testing, right? So if I make an API request here, passing some headers and some parameters, when I hit send, I can see my response come back. I can see my latency times, my fetch times. I can validate my response headers. Great. I just did a manual API test. This is where most people stop, right? Everything looks good to me. I'm good to go. And generally, this is fine, right? But when you want to move into that automation space, like I was saying with the pipelines, run those API tests first. If they fail, stop your build. And what we've done is added a auto-generate functionality. And what this is going to do is it's going to essentially do that test everything part for you at a basic level. So if I go ahead and, I already have, my naming conventions are terrible. So if I go ahead and write that one right there, you can see that the tool is actually going to create an automated test for you. And what the test is going to do is it's going to validate things that we were talking about. Make your request, validate the return type headers, validate all of the objects that are being returned, and not just things like, yeah, it's returning a name object to me, or it's returning a category to me, but things like it's returning a URL, but is that URL actually a valid URL, right? Not just some string. Is it an actual working URL? A price is being returned to me. Is that price being returned to me in the way it should be, like a float type? Or is it being returned in a weird way that's a string, right? This sort of may or may not seem super important, but then you run your UI test and somebody's trying to look at how much your table costs and it says blue, right? That's not sort of working for your end customer. I would be done buying that desk there if I'm not able to see what the price is. So things like that, validating the return type is very important. And in a matter of seconds, I have now a test that I can run at any moment, validate all of my responses. I can then schedule this test to run in an automated fashion directly in the platform, or I can integrate it into my CI platform, just like I would any other testing, to validate the responses, see if there's any failures, fail out of my pipeline if there are any failures or anything like that. And then, from here, you're able to add what we were talking about, that business logic, right? Adding in things like, well, what if I do an input parameter of table, should I get my responses correctly, right? Validating things like the response time. So like, I want to say that this API should have a latency that is no greater than 50 milliseconds, right? And so things like validating response times, validating that your API is working as intended so that your front end is going to work as intended, right? If I'm requesting details and the site's going to wait for 5 seconds because your API is taking a really long time to respond, that's just not a good workflow that you really want at the end of the day. And so validating that at this layer before you even get to page load times and anything like that. So determining, well, if my API is the issue here, then I know right away. Whereas if you were to go on the UI layer and say, my page is taking 10 seconds to load, that could be anything, right? Anything could be causing that. And then it makes it much harder to debug, and then you're delaying your testing and delaying your deployments. And so something to think about there. Other things like doing that end-to-end flow, like I talked about, is as simple as stringing together your API requests, right? And so if I pop over to something that I have built out already, there we go. Having that ability to do like a request like this, a post request, where is essentially my login request, right? When I'm logging in my website, I'm passing in my username and my password. My API is going to authenticate that for me, send back a token so that I'm my login is authenticated. And then doing something like adding things to a cart, adding some objects into there, some products, and then validating that actually what I did add into the cart is essentially there. I did that adding to cart actually work. So requesting the information back and saying, okay, is exactly what I put in there, what is in there? And then having a logout function, which I don't have here, but having that logout function for a full end-to-end from start to finish, right in a single API test, right? Now this one API test, I can run it in my pipeline and say, is my full flow working? Awesome. Let's try the full flow on the UI side of things. And so that whole idea of one-to-one testing at your API layer, especially nowadays where we're moving towards that microservice structure where everything is essentially API driven, right? I have a customer that I work with a lot, and they're basically putting in a rule now that says anything you build has to have an API behind it so that any other team can ingest it much easier. And I know a lot of folks are moving towards that. And so I think the testing of APIs is more and more important nowadays than it was ever before. And then tying this into visual, I think, is that same principle of easier debugging, quicker analysis, quicker fixes, right? When I'm running a long functional test, it's hard to figure out exactly what errored out, right? Like if my API is actually the issue or something else the issue, same thing on the functional side. And so that's really what visual allows you to do, right? The visual, I can come into here, I can choose this test here. And so on the left-hand side, I have my previous build of my website. Everything looks good. I accepted it. I said, this is exactly what I want my website to look like. On the right-hand side, I did a new build and something got messed up. And for any Friends fans out there, it's an image of Joey thrown everywhere and a couple other issues that have happened, right? And so if I ran a functional test on this, sure, I would notice if I did assertions on things, I would notice that there's issues. But it might take me an hour before my test finishes, and then 20 minutes pouring through thousands of lines of logs to exactly figure out what happened. Whereas here, I can come over here and see, well, this is not right. And if I hover over it, I can see exactly what it's used to look like in my previous build, what it looks like right now, what else has changed. And even easier, I can pop right over to the right-hand side and see exactly what's changed, right? Okay, so my image height box has changed here, or the actual source file of the image has changed. Visibility of the text box changed somehow, and something changed at that layer. And so what our visual tool is offering is not only this idea of pixel by pixel comparison, right? Exactly what has changed, what's moved, but a deeper layer at the DOM levels to say exactly underneath what has changed, right? Not only did your image box move or get larger, but exactly what happened. Oh, your visibility tag changed, or your image source file changed. And having that ability to come into here and quickly see that. So taking from me reading thousands of lines of logs to me just coming in here and saying, well, I know exactly what changed and I can see it here. Or I can come into here and say, yeah, my image sources are supposed to change. It's a very dynamic site. I don't want to be warned about that, flagged about that. I can come into here and just ignore them. And so now every time I do my build, I won't get flagged that the images source have changed, but I still want to know if like the box size changed or if the dimensions are off, right? Like if you were to go to our Sauce Labs swag website and try to buy some sauce gear, but you saw this, it would sort of deter you from buying our products, right? I sure wouldn't want to buy this without seeing what the backpack looked like. And then I probably would forget about it and never come back to buy it again. I might just go buy the backpack somewhere else. And so that idea of testing the way it looks visually on top of doing the functionality and the UI stuff, right? So the first thing everyone notices when they go to your website or they use applications is how does it look, right? Before they click on anything, before they say, oh, it's a little laggy, the first thing they're going to say is, oh, it looks kind of stretched out. Like it looks like they didn't test this properly, or it looks like they sort of sloppily threw this together. And so that idea of doing this visual testing right up the front and validating that it looks good as well as properly functions in the backside. And so with that, I do want to transition into the visual side of things and have Kunal kind of dive deeper into why visual is important and why it is sort of in line with this idea of quicker testing and quicker analysis. Stop my share.
Thank you so much for the demo. I think it sets things up really well. So as you folks already saw what sort of visual is capable of, we'll just go in like what are we doing over here. So as we were going through like the early part of the presentation where we talked about the experiences of that most importance at this point, the idea here is that just having functional tests is not going to cut it anymore. Like it's really hard. Like if you think of scenarios where you have a really well functioning functional test which goes through your shopping cart, it passes, it does everything. But as we were seeing in the demo, it has wrong images, or it has wrong colors, or it has wrong elements. The functional test will not really catch those things. It will just go through and pass. And from the customer standpoint, like the expectation is, well, how did they test this? Like, I don't know why I'm seeing these funny images on there, or what's going on with the colors, or what's going on with these elements. So it gets really complex as we are trying to ship our software really fast. And as we are sort of going into this hyper velocity mode, as we were talking about early on, where you have to deploy multiple times a day. So you really need that confidence before you ship software to your customers. And the other tricky thing with visual is there are nuances. When you look at the screens, when you look at the elements, it's really hard to catch it through your eyes. Like even though being on product, I test the UI, like Sauce UI every day, there are things which are like, well, this looks fine. And then you run a visual regression. It's like, oh, I see the element moved, or the sort of the backdrop or the back shadow changed. And those minor things do matter to a few folks, like where you're using like some sort of screen readers or things like that, where it will throw it off. So it gets really tricky to cache all these visual regressions just by merely looking at them. And it is definitely complex, like it's complicated, it's out of reach. Like when you start going down the visual testing realm, there is sort of this idea of that, hey, I can just quickly run my functional test, check everything that's on the UI, and get the confidence. But then as we were just discussing, like the nuances of that, it gets complex, it gets expensive. When you leave those bugs, they sort of go out, you get a very, I would say just a poor user experience, and customers sort of come back and say, well, what happened? Like, did you not see? It was so obvious that the color changed, or it was so obvious that the image changed. So basically from the visual standpoint, what we are trying to do is we're trying to simplify this testing. We're trying to simplify the universe of sort of the visual regression you can run into. So having a way, as Sangeet just showed, like the snapshots becomes a really powerful tool for you. Like as you're going through your Selenium test, the test which you've already written, and combining the power of visual tool on top, it actually provides the end customers, your customers, like the digital confidence which they are looking for, and for you sort of the peace of mind that I can ship the software which I'm writing and be very confident that it will provide the best user experience possible when it goes out to my customers. So it reduces the time to market. It actually increases velocity on the teams and helps the team sort of ship more software faster, just by making it easy for you, and making it easy and being more confident that whatever I'm writing is actually providing value, and it's going to be the right thing for my customers. So basically what visual has done, it's bringing like the functional and the visual aspects together. And the whole idea is you don't have to write more code to do that. You can actually write less code. You can have the visual diffs, and it simplifies your life in terms of the separation, as Sangeet was showing, between doing functional tests and the visual tests. So you can still run your functional test, you still get the value of the functionality, because you need to know whether the end-to-end your shopping cart is working or not. But what visual is also bringing into the play is like, I'm confident now that the button placements are in the right place, the images placements are in the right place. Like, again, like imagine a scenario like you're checking out, as Sangeet was showing, like, let's say the button, generally everyone is used to the checkout button being on the right sort of bottom corner, and you go through it, you see it there. But from a functional testing standpoint, let's say if the button moved to the top left corner, the test would pass. It will find the button, it will click on it, will get through. But from a visual standpoint, like when a user goes on the page, they're like, well, where is the button? How do I check out from here? So it gets really confusing and throws people off. And that's where the visual testing sort of kicks in. And that's where it becomes really powerful for you to catch those early challenges early on and issues early on within your life cycle. So what sort of the visual product provides? So it provides sort of two different components. One is the visual component in itself, which sort of integrates with your storybook. So it's a really powerful way. I sort of think of it in a way of a unit test. So the design system is all about different elements, different components on your page. The way visual component works, it basically integrates with your storybook, and you can test those components early on. So it, as sort of Matt mentioned early on, it breaks that silo of like a front-end engineer and a developer sort of working basically on their own, and the QA doing it on the side. It brings those two, like the QAs and the front-end engineers together and saying like, let's just write these storybook tests and make sure the elements and the components that we are creating, they work well. And it's sort of from there, you sort of start getting the feedback early on in your developer lifecycle. You're writing those components, you're testing those components early on to get to know that the component is the right component. Once you pass that stage, then comes your visual end-to-end, which is basically now you are going through a functional test all the way through. You're running your tests, as we talked about, getting through a card, checking out, and in that flow, you can inject the visual testing and say like, I also want to check whether the website and my pages look fine, and are they actually doing what it's expected to do. So it basically tackles the problem from both sides early on. So it's cheaper, it's easier, it's faster, so you can do component testing. And on the other side, from the end-to-end perspective, like towards the end, before you are going to say like, I'm going to ship this thing, I'm going to put it out to my customers, you can catch the issues where there may be distinction in images, or drop shadows, or element changes, like all those type of things. When they sort of all come together, you can catch those issues early on before it goes out. How does it work? So as we saw in the quick demo, it creates a baseline. So the idea behind the tool is pretty simple. Like if you think about it, it's just taking your baselines. It basically looks at your current existing product, your website, it will take a screenshot, and from there you have to go in and approve and say like, yes, this is my baseline. I prove this is the thing which I'm going to look for. From there, any changes going forward will be actually measured against those baselines. So the tool will always go back and check, is the image in the right place? Is the DOM the same? Are we moving something around on the page? So it's basically going to create that baseline, and then everything else is getting tested around that baseline. So again, like if you think of it in terms of, we have seen like really, really interesting use cases of customers going in and trying it out. They have done it from the sense of just doing just a shell of a website, like looking at different components on the website, whether the placements are right or not. To some points, we have also seen these interesting cases where folks are doing some sort of testing around their content and looking at like, are we seeing the right thing or not on the screen? So it basically explodes into like multiple use cases which you can run through from a visual tool standpoint. And the power of the tool is that you can have that pixel by pixel comparison, the snapshot comparison. You can look at the DOM, and you can work with the developer and the engineering teams and collaborate with them and show them where you're seeing those distinctions, where you're seeing those differences. And all that, the nice thing is, could be done by just adding a few lines within the Selenium code. So you don't have to rewrite your script. You don't have to change the flows. It's just an addition on top of the functional test that already exists. So it makes it really easy and powerful mechanism to like just getting more confidence, and it's ease of use and speed as you're going through your just the delivery lifecycle. So from the best practices, I'll again dovetail back to what Sangeet showed. It's basically like you're doing your API testing, you're doing your visual testing and regression, like the regression testing, functional regression testing at the same time. The idea there is you do want to run your visual tests sort of independent of functional tests to just make sure that if there are any errors happening, where are they? Like you can, again, from pipelining perspective, you can run them in sort of a CI standard pipeline. You run your functional test, you run your visual test. The nice thing is running them in parallel, you'll quickly catch, oh, this is where I see the functional issues are happening or the visual issues are happening. And then you can, it just reduces the time to market. So that I would say is a really good recommendation, and try it out, like how it sort of spans. It fits in your current existing tool. So again, if you're using CI, you can integrate visual with your CI tools. If you're using like Storybook, you can start using the component tests to get that easy and fast access and early feedback throughout the life cycle as the teams are actually delivering and shipping the different components which they're building. So from a visual standpoint, like just going through, I would again follow up back with the testing diamond. Like the idea behind that, I want to do as much functional testing, but I do want to get that additional layer of confidence by doing this visual testing, and perhaps moving some of those functional tests where you were trying to assert on different elements on the UI, which could be done through the visual side. So having like the power of your functional test and sort of getting it with, grouping it with the visual test to get the best experience possible at the end for your customers. Off to you, Matt.
Sorry about that, a little issue with audio. Thank you, Kunal. Thank you, Sanjeev. So what we just talked through are, I think, significant changes in how we think about tests. Even though they seem straightforward, the opportunity to do all of these from one place. And let's move to the next slide if we could. Oop. There we go. The opportunity to do all these from the same environment is incredibly powerful. So I think more and more people are trying to bring in these different techniques. And we talked a bit today, Sanjeev talked about the pyramid turning into the diamond, talked about mocking. We talked about thinking about your services independently from the APIs. We also touched on just briefly orchestration. So Sanjeev showed that, how you can orchestrate different one API to the next, so you can get sequences of validation. And then Kunal, of course, showed how you can think about the customer experience and how you can think about it not only from an end-to-end standpoint, but also from a design system component model, and really build it up so that you can start to distribute your testing a little differently. So I think one of the questions as you look at all these different possible signals is, well, how do we put all these together? And I noticed a number of the questions, and we'll get to Q&A in just a moment, and I look forward to the conversations. But a number of the questions were about, how do we put this together? How do we actually optimize in this kind of environment where there's so many different signals, and we're now starting to introduce so many different types of testing with across many different people. So one of the challenges of not having a singular siloed organization, QA, is that now everyone's doing it. Now everyone's active. It's like everyone's going in a different direction. How do you get a view of the whole world? And so this is where our product journey is really taking us. So our product journey is now looking across each of these areas and providing signals in each of these different spots. Maybe we can go to the next. There we go. In each of these different spots. And really, we call this the DevOps test tool chain, right? It's a tool chain, not a single product, right? You can use pieces. You don't have to use all of it. Use the elements that work best for you. But our goal, our journey strategically, is to start to pull these together so that you can think about a use case and then have all the tests necessary for that use case in one place, where you can think about your emergent test plan. In other words, you want to be able to look at your code base and understand, well, where is it getting tested? What parts of the experience are being tested? What kinds of tests are we getting? What kinds of failures do we typically have? For example, in one organization, the APIs may be very solid, but you may get a lot of visual errors. In another organization, you may get the exact reverse, right? So being able to see that holistically, and frankly, it's likely team by team, being able to have each team draw from those elements that they need easily is really the direction we're moving in. And so we expect to build, and we're already doing so, a holistic experience that gives you access to all these different signals and gives you reporting across all of them in one place, and gives you test results for all these in one place, and allows you to coordinate and orchestrate across all these signals in one place. And we will talk a lot more about that at SauceCon in May, including some exciting announcements then. But this is the overall picture of how we are thinking about the world and how we're driving forward. And this is the context in which both API testing and visual testing, we think, fit in the larger test automation framework that all of you are building. I think now it'd be great to go to Q&A, and we'd be happy to answer questions that people might have. Susie, back to you as our moderator.
Fantastic. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Sangeet and Kunal. Really appreciate those presentations, both the high level and then, of course, those deep dives on API and visual. I think a lot of great content that we covered in the past 45 minutes. And lots more to get into. Our audience has been active with questions. So we do have just over 10 minutes for Q&A. Our attendees with us live, if you have additional questions, again, please use that Q&A window from the Zoom webinar toolbar, and we will get through as many as we can in the time that we have. I will also note our team here has been responding to some of those questions in writing, so you can see those responses in the answered questions portion of that Q&A window. So I want to kick off here with a question that came in that covers API, visual, UI. And Sangeet, I might turn this one to you to start us off. So Jessica was asking about, with features that span API, visual, UPI tests, like a shopping cart, do we have any advice for running and viewing all of the test results for a specific feature, right? So the example is sometimes only the shopping cart needs to be regression tested. It can be difficult to select that and then run the API, visual, and UI tests that are just for the shopping cart.
Yeah, that's a really good question. The way we handle that on the API side of things is by tagging, right? So you can tag your tests with specific keywords, and one could be like shopping cart. And so you can have a test running your entire suite, kicking off every single test in your project, or you can say, just kick off my test with the tag shopping cart or cart, and then that would only execute those tests. And then that same tagging structure can be used in our dashboarding. So when you go into view the data, you can just filter by that tag, only see the results for that one or any test tagged with that result. Same goes for pulling data out. So we do have an API that lets you export data and push it wherever you want. You can also filter by tag in that scenario as well. And so that's sort of the idea there, right? And that's actually a really good question, because that's what you're going to want to do. You're not always going to want to test the entire suite every single time.
Great, thank you, Sangeet. Kunal, anything you want to add on that?
Oh, I think that's that. I would say, like, from a visual standpoint, if we I'm pretty sure you can tag the Selenium test and it would sort of operate in a similar way. So if you have like robust tagging, which sort of goes across the two different tools, and from a CI standpoint, I'm assuming you can inject those tags and basically say, like, just run this feature test. So just doubling down on tagging and making sure, or filtering based on the other thing which I have seen folks do is like just grouping in terms of your folder structure, and then you can sort of say, like, these are the folders which are impacted, or these are tests within these different functional areas within my directory structure, and then you can run those tests across. So some ideas around like how you can tackle this issue where you don't have to run all the tests all the time.
Great, thank you for that. And Kunal, I'm going to stay with you. We have a couple of folks separately in here asking about linking up with GitHub and asking if we can save or baseline images in a GitHub source repo. Is there a GitHub integration where they can store image diffs in source control? Can you provide some insight on that?
Yeah, so I don't think the product allows you today to store it in GitHub diffs. Like, it does store internally within Visual Tools, so you have to come to Visual. But again, like, those are really good recommendations which we can take back to the teams and see what could be done in terms of like saving it. I'm assuming the thought there is that you can have it within your own repo, which is outside of the Visual product, where you can save these diffs and consume them. So again, I think it's a good recommendation.
Great.
We do integrate with GitHub from a visual standpoint.
Fantastic. And for additional recommendations, if folks here have great ideas they want to pass along, where should they be sending those, Kunal? Are you going to share your personal email address? Is that how we're?
Happy to. Please feel free. You can also just email me, or you can email support, whatever avenues you have. More than happy. The product team is always willing to jump on calls to understand your particular use cases and your challenges and problems that you're facing. So we'll more than happy to come in and chat.
Yes, thank you. Question here about security features. Sangeet, I want to start with you because I think this came in during your API presentation, and then Matt might ask you to jump in from a bigger picture view on this. Attendee here is asking if there are any security features that would avoid logging restricted or sensitive data into logs in order for them to help meet data retention and security guidelines that they have at their enterprise scale company.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So first of all, overall, holistically in terms of security, the Sauce Connect proxy tunnel does work across all your Sauce core products as well as visual and API testing. And so that connecting into your lower environments, testing against those, we have that covered in a very secure fashion. In terms of data retention and storage, what I would say right now is that our data retention and storage is all securely held, and it all falls under our security compliances that we have in place. So SOC 2 compliance, ISO 27001, all of that. With regards to API testing, at the moment, because the executions are all, the test creation and executions are happening on the platform, we do store sort of all of the data that's being held there. You do have the ability to wipe that at any moment. So if you don't want that retained in the dashboard, you can go in and wipe that. We are working on data obfuscation and data storage when it comes to APIs. And so that's something that's coming and it's being worked on right now.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sangeet. Matt, anything you want to add from sort of a broader Sauce perspective on security features and concerns that folks might have around that? It's an important topic for us, I know.
Actually, that's exactly what I would add. We recognize security is really critical, especially the kinds of systems that are being validated and worked with, and also with the data privacy and whatnot. This is why we push so hard to get SOC 2 Type 2, as well as ISO 27001. The overall product team will continue to invest heavily in security and security concerns. Sauce Connect is a component that we have and we continue to work on and make better and better and better. At this point, it is incredibly stable and fast, and we're continuing to move in that direction and make it even faster. So this is a topic that is near and dear to us. We recognize absolutely how important it is. And again, just like Kunal said, always happy to take comments and questions in this area. It's one of the first things we think about when we're looking at new products and new capabilities. So it's a good question. It's always on our mind.
Great, thank you, Matt. Kunal, we've got a few visual focus questions in here. I'm going to jump back to you on a couple of these, maybe a lightning round. Two separate folks asking about the availability of masking for ignoring specific elements in their visual tests.
Yeah, you can. I was just going to paste a link to the doc. So you can definitely ignore different areas. You can ignore different components, and I'm passing the doc along so you can sort of read up and see if that sort of suits the needs. But there are ways to ignore particular areas within the pages.
Yeah,
fantastic.
Maybe I can add something to that. That's actually the way it's built out. You have two options for ignoring. One is after the fact. So when you're reviewing your screenshots, you can ignore them for future use cases. Or if you know ahead of time, like the example with the QR code, right when you're taking your visual snapshots, you can add ignore selectors in there and it won't even bother flagging it the first time.
Great. And then this another visual question, and I know this is one that we are talking about internally. So we'll give the folks here in the room as much as we can, but people want to know about mobile support, and I want to throw it out there because I know mobile is critical, right? We know that here, you all attending today, you know that your mobile presence is critical. And obviously we at Sauce Labs are here to support that. And just want to give everyone some insider context, whatever we can, around this question of, do we have visual testing support for mobile apps?
Yeah, no, so that's a great question. And again, like I would love, whoever is there, like would love to jump on call to understand like how you are planning to test it with mobile. We don't support it with mobile today with native apps, but not to say like that's been top of the team's mind and something which we're actively trying to sort of unpack and see how we can get going. So it's something which does not exist today, but I would not say that it's not going to exist in future. That's definitely something which we're going to add.
Just adding another comment to that, the engine that runs visual in the core takes not just screenshots, but also pulls entire DOM shots. And it is very intelligent in terms of how the DOM is structured on the page. And you can actually create mechanisms such that it can validate that the DOM itself is structured the way you want it to. We're not talking about it today, but we have a product mobile beta testing that actually takes native apps and generates a virtual DOM from those and is able to do some very interesting work around the virtual DOM on mobile. And this is specifically in the context of mobile beta testing. We're putting mobile apps into the real world. From that, you can imagine that we see a path forward for how we're going to bring visual to mobile. And when we do so, it will be one that takes into account the actual structure of the native app, not just images. So it's something that we're thinking about quite a lot.
Great, thank you both. I know we just have a couple of minutes left, lots of great questions still in the Q&A, so please do reach out. Again, that webinar@saucelabs.com is open to you. I get those emails, I know how to find these guys, so do reach out if there are things that we can continue going on from here. But just to close this out, I want to finish with a question that we got pre-submitted from one of our registrants that I think really captures a lot of what we were talking about today, and just want to get some final thoughts. This user was asking about where visual and API testing fit into the SDLC, what roles are involved in using these tools, and specifically here, since I know we talked about two of those first two questions, what are some best practices you have found to add visual and API testing to a definition of done for a user story? So pulling a lot of what we were talking about together, would just love to get some final thoughts from the three of you on fitting visual and API testing into our full lifecycle process.
Maybe I'll jump in really briefly and then I'll hand over to Kunal and Sanjeev. Sure. One thing that I've heard customers talk about is bringing more people to the table. And so one thing that visual allows you to do is bring your design team to the table and really work with your design team. So it's not just about developers and SDETs and quality people, that you can now reach out and the design team can get involved in what's right and what's not. And they can also do reviews because it's a very easy to use application. You don't just have to have I'll in quotes say the developer that's looking through. You can actually start to have other people get involved and watch not only on the design system, which you would do through your storybook component testing, but also in some of the end-to-end flows. And so we see that as very powerful, and we've seen customers do that very effectively. Kunal, Sanjeev?
Sure, yeah, I can add some color to that. I think when we talk about API testing, it's the earlier the better, right? Most folks tend to build backend systems before building front-end systems on top of that. So getting that API testing done much earlier in your life cycle, but also doing API testing at the end of your cycle, right? So production monitoring and things like that is something we talk about all the time and we're big proponents of. And so not only doing heavy testing in the beginning, but also having some monitors running continuously for especially critical APIs, right? Like if you're a retail site and your checkout process is done through APIs, you don't want that to go down because that literally means you're losing money. And so monitoring that, knowing that your API is down before anybody could submit a bug report is, I think, an awesome thing to have it put into place. And so I would say API fits in bookended right at the beginning and right at the end.
Yeah, from a visual standpoint, I would say like as the product provides two different capabilities. So like component being early on in the stage, just because you want it to be faster, you want it to be cheaper, you want to cache those components when they're actually getting built early on. And from the end-to-end side, it's more around like when you're running those functional tests, like sort of tagging those tests with the visual product to make sure like you're getting that confidence in terms of your releases, that the function, not only does the functionality works, but visually it makes sense when I ship it. So as Sangeet is mentioning, like from an API standpoint, the APIs might be working, functional tests might be working, but then the visually the buttons might be off. And from a functional test perspective, that's fine, but that's where the visual power comes in. So a lot of times you just want to know them early on before it hits your customer. So again, like splitting those tests into areas like component and end-to-end, that's what I would say would be my recommendation.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Really glad we could bring that all back together at the end here. Unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for today's webinar. I want to say thank you again to Matt, Sangeet, Kunal for these wonderful presentations and insights. And of course, thank you so much to everyone for tuning in, for submitting all of those fantastic questions and making this a really fun conversation for the team.